Assalamu alaikum, I'm Munib Ali on the Qur'an study channel. Now last week I posted a video where we studied whether it was possible that Prophet Muhammad actually married a child, as many people believe, a 6-year-old child. And we showed from the Qur'an that this was not possible, that this would have been against the commandments of God. And at the end of the video, I said that part 2 was going to be focused on the flaws, on the history that is written, on which people rely to state that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, married a 6-year-old girl. But I've had to change my plan. The reason is that what I want to do now in part 2, inshallah, is address some of the disputes that have been put forward in response to part 1. Because I want us to be clear about what the Qur'an is saying. And if there is confusion in the mind, then we will not be able to move forward. And there are 2 disputes we're going to be looking at. But before we do that, let's just remind ourselves what we studied in part 1. And in summary, this is what we studied. We studied that the Qur'an tells us that number 1, the man and woman must both have the intellectual and physical maturity to understand, to agree to, and to comply with the contract of marriage. And we studied these 4 verses. And the second thing that we studied from the Qur'an was that Prophet Muhammad strictly followed the commandments contained in the Qur'an. And we studied these 2 verses here to understand that. Now, despite this being quite clear from the Qur'an, the first dispute that was put forward was this: that actually the Qur'an itself, in chapter 65 verse 4, God confirms that a man can indeed marry a little girl. This is a very important point to address. In fact, I should have addressed this point in the video itself, because this verse is commonly used by 2 types of people. Firstly, those people who do not believe in the Qur'an, who do not follow Islam, the enemies of Islam. They will use this verse to try and convince people that actually God allows men to marry young children, young girls. And the second type of people who point to this verse are those who do not understand the true meaning of this verse, who are simply following and agreeing with those people who have told them from their own interpretation what this verse means. So we're going to take a look at this. And here is the verse. Chapter 65, verse 4. And the part of this verse which is used by those people is this: Wallahi lam yahidna, and those who did not menstruate. And because this verse is referring to divorce, which I'll come on to in a second, and it is referring to individuals who did not menstruate, people take this part of the verse to be referring to girls, pre-pubescent girls. Now we're going to study this verse properly, and we're going to show how dangerous it is to take a small part of a particular verse and use that to conclude on a preconceived idea. Just this little part of a verse is taken by those individuals to suggest that Islam allows men to marry little girls. Now, the first thing to say about this, and I've said this many times when I'm describing how God has instructed us to study the Qur'an, is context. We have to understand the context in which this verse has been described. All of the verses around 65:4 relate to divorce and the waiting period of a previously married woman before she can remarry. That is the context of this verse. It is not about who you can marry. It is about the waiting period of a woman that has previously married. And we have already studied from the Qur'an what God tells us about the marital age of both a man and a woman. Okay, so that's the first thing, the context. Now, let's take a look at this verse in more detail. So it says, as for those who have reached menopause from your women. Now, let's pause here. The word that God has used is nisa'ikum, nisa. When God is using the word nisa here, it means women, grown, mature women. Nisa does not mean girls. It is referring to a grown, mature woman. Now that in itself should clarify that this dispute is false and has no standing. The dispute that this verse is referring to the ability to marry young girls. Right at the beginning of this verse, God is clarifying that this verse is about grown women. But in any case, let's move on. If you have any doubts, the waiting period shall be 3 months. Now what God is telling us here, and we see this a little bit later on, that we are trying to identify here whether the divorced woman is carrying a child, is pregnant. Because that has an important implication in terms of the timings of her getting married again. And God is saying that for women who have reached menopause, if you have any doubts as to whether they may be pregnant, if there are doubts about it, then they will have to wait. They should wait 3 months. Clear? Let's move on. And remember, this is the bit which those people are using to raise this dispute. Wallahi lam yahidna. And those who did not menstruate. So what God is saying is that those grown women, not just those who have reached menopause, but those who do not menstruate or who have not been menstruating, wait 3 months. And there could be many reasons why a woman could not be menstruating. It could be because of a physiological reason. There could be a medical reason. There are many reasons why a grown woman may not be menstruating. And what God is simply saying is that if you have any doubts, then wait 3 months. It is quite simple. And then God describes what that means. And those who are pregnant, so if you find that they are pregnant in the end, then the waiting period is until they give birth to the child. So this verse has no relationship whatsoever to any sort of allowance for a man to marry a child. It has nothing to do with that. This is simply describing the waiting period that a grown woman that has gone through a divorce has to wait before she decides to marry again. So let's go back to what we studied in part 1. The man and woman must both have the intellectual and physical maturity to understand, to agree to, and to comply with the contract of marriage. There is nothing in the Qur'an that suggests that a man can marry a child. The marital age is dependent on the intellectual and physical maturity of both the man and woman. Okay, and the second dispute, and this one will take far fewer minutes to describe and discuss, is this. It is said that it was common Jewish and Muslim practice at that time, at the time that the Qur'an was being revealed, for men to marry young girls. And therefore it is possible that Prophet Mohammad married a 6-year-old girl. Brothers and sisters, this is completely irrelevant. It is irrelevant because we are talking about a prophet. And we studied in the Qur'an that the prophet strictly followed the commandments contained in the Qur'an. So it is irrelevant whether we've been told by our forefathers or the enemies of Islam that during that time Muslims and Jews married young girls. It is completely irrelevant to the topic that we are studying. And that is all I will say on that. I hope that is clear. My dear brothers and sisters, we must learn how to dispel the preconceived notions, the falsehood the history that has been ingrained in our minds, what we have been told by our forefathers, by some of our supposed scholars and imams, when it comes to such slanderous teachings about Islam and Prophet Muhammad. Now, if you want to have a look at another sincere, humble Qur'an student's study of this verse of 65:4, then go and have a look at the video actually done quite recently by Brother Joseph on the Qur'an Centric channel, who explains this verse very well. I will leave a link to that video in the description to this video as well. And with that, I will just say that now part 3, rather than part 2, as my plan changed, part 3 will be about looking at this historical narration which people trust and believe and rely on to say Prophet Muhammad married Aisha when she was 6 years old. Now, we must already, hopefully, given that we've studied the Qur'an, have understood that this piece of history is flawed, is false, is inaccurate, but we will still do part 3, inshallah, because we will look at history from history itself to show that this is false. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.
أفلا يتدبرون القرآن